Hello to everyone. Welcome to this last part of Quiltmania's mystery quilt. This time I'll show you shortly the embellishing, and we will concentrate on the quilting, binding and finishing touches. Once you sew the borders to the top, you prepare the appliques the usual way. Cut them out from the fabrics I suggested, or just make your own choice. Applique them with the thread colors you find in Quiltmania, or make your own choice again, and go ahead. One new thing this time are the two colored leaves. To fix the two parts together, I embroidered slanted stitches on both sides of the leaf. You come up on one side and you go down on the other, all the way up the vein. On the light pink flowers, you find that the applique heart is set in. On the other group, I did French knots with the pearly 5 and some pistil stitches. See the cornflowers? I did the sides with the stem stitch and the outer edges of the petals with small perpendicular stitches. I did French knots for the heart and added straight stitches in black for the contrast. Here I placed a large peony similar to the peony from block 3. The heart is set in. Use small perpendicular stitches to fix the yellow and pink fabrics. The center is stuffed and adorned with French knots and pistil stitches. The edges of the petals are fixed with some bright moulinet, and after stuffing, I added long and short stitches. Here you can see what the petals look like before embellishing. So I immerse the needle in the petal and go down at the outer edge between the fixing stitches. I vary the stitch length, and to do this first row I used the moulinet orange variegated. So you can either go down with the needle between the fixing stitches or just outside the petal, hiding the fixing stitches. And you can also mix both ways. Then you do a second row with another color. So at this edge here I did 2 rows with the column with the orange thread and a third row with orange and pink. In your kit there are different pinks you can choose from. Pick out the one you prefer and enjoy. Immerse the needle in the petal and stitch towards the outer edge, going down between the previous rows. Vary the stitch length. This is always important. A detail for the dark red leaves. The vein stops before the outer edge of the petal and the stuffing joins. A last detail. You can sometimes see, once you have finished quilting, that some stitches snag at the point of the leaves, for example. This happens because the quilting makes the quilt shrink, and therefore some stitches might get loose. To mend that, just thread a needle with the proper color, make the knot disappear in the batting, and fix with some stitches what needs to be mended. For the quilt back, you will need a surface of 1 yard 2/3 square, so you need to buy twice that length. Cut one of the lengths into 2 in the fabric fold. I use the selvages to align and pin perfectly the 2 pieces of fabric together, and after that I sew at about 7/8 inches from the edge, and then I cut the excess fabric off. Here you see that I trimmed away the excess fabric, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I ironed the piece and opened the seam allowance. This is my preference because the seam allowance is less bulky when I quilt. When this is done, you must layer and baste your quilt. It helps to have a large table, since this job can be rough on your back, but if your table isn't large enough, you'll have to do this on the floor. On the table, you can use binder clips. On the floor, you'll have to tape it. Then I place the batting. I use thin synthetic batting for almost all my quilts. Center the batting on the top, leave it flat and wrinkle-free. Trim the excess so that the batting is even with the backing. Then fold the batting in two and spray some temporary glue on the batting. Place it back, smooth out the wrinkles. Work towards the edges with your hands. Repeat this process with the second half. And keep in mind that the glue is always sprayed on the batting, never ever on the fabric. Then take the top. Make sure that you removed all the cheesecloth, about 2-3 millimeters from the trapunto and embroideries. This will make your quilting easier. Then place the quilt top on top of the batting, aligning the center of the quilt with the center of the batting. You have about a 3-inch margin all around the quilt. Fold the top in two. Spray the glue on the batting. On this side, you must spray the glue quite generously. And watch out for glue lumps. They look like white tears. Let them dry, otherwise you could have stains on your top. This happened to me once and I felt very sorry for myself because these stains don't go away. So after checking, place your top on the batting. It will stay in place thanks to the glue, so you can stretch your blocks into shape. The edges of the blocks must be as straight as possible. Starting from the center of the quilt, stretch the sashing first and work from the block to the border corners. Smooth out all wrinkles with your hands. When one half is done, fold your top and repeat the process. At this stage, you can already see that the wrinkles have mostly disappeared. They are kind of absorbed by the batting. And now I'll finish the edge of the quilt, as my table isn't quite large enough, repeating the whole process with the glue, first on the back, then on the top. Now the top is ready and quite flat, but for the corners. The excess fabric seems to concentrate here, and the wrinkles are more pronounced because of the trapunto work in the corners. Do not worry. All these wrinkles will disappear when you have quilted your top. It's the same with this block here. We stuffed all around the block, so the excess fabric accumulates in the center, but everything will disappear with the quilting. So I repeat, when you place the top on the batting, it's crucial that you put the blocks into shape. putting one hand onto the cornerstone in the center and pulling the sashing towards the outer edges crosswise. The next step for you being thread basting. Unless you plan to quilt your quilt in 3 weeks' time as we are, I strongly advise you to baste your quilt because the glue will disappear over the months. Baste the grid apart 4 to 6 inches for the best result. Let's now start the quilting. You will need a hoop, a pack of between needles. I like using number 9 from print, which I think work very well with Pearly 8. We used color Écru or 712 for the light background. DMC sells fat skeins. Prepare them like this. Take the paper rings off, undo the twist, and then make one cut. Then plait the lengths together, and when you need thread, just gently pull out one of the plait. Take a needle, make a sharp cut on the thread. Make the end of the thread almost disappear between the pulp of your thumb and forefinger. And making a downwards movement, place the eye of the needle on top of the thread's end and push. Your needle's threaded. Make a knot on the other end. You also need a needle puller and 2 thimbles, one for the middle finger of your right hand and one for the forefinger of your left hand. Start in the middle of your quilt. Place the inner part of the hoop under the quilt. Unwind almost the whole screw. Place it on top. Place the screw anywhere without embroideries and leave a little bit of give for working the needle in and out of the layers more easily. And also don't worry about damaging your embroideries with the hoop. It cannot happen. It cannot happen. And now Claudine is going to show you the quilting. She pulls the thread to place the knot into the batting. The first row of stitches are placed about 2 millimeters from the stem. She's not trying to make very small stitches. The result is much nicer when you use Pearly 8 if you stitch about 5 inches per inch. Claudine has just quilted around 2 leaves. Unfortunately, we don't see them very well on the front side, so we show you the back. She started 2 millimeters, 1/16 inch from the leaf, stitched all around the leaf. Then a second row, spaced between 1/4 and 3/8 inch from the first line. The line stops here. Let's turn the quilt. The stitching with color Écru or 712 stops at the block, and Claudine went on with color 3760 because I find it nicer to use a tone-on-tone thread. Therefore, we used color 902 for the purple fabrics. Mark the serration of the leaf in the first row. In the second, the serration is less marked, and on the third row you have a gentle curve. On this leaf in the border, I stitch only 2 rows because the design of the block is more important, so I need space to stitch around that leaf. We stitch the cornerstones with Pearly 8 blue, and she stitched at about 1/4 inch off the seams. When your quilt is quilted, place it flat on a large table. You will use the cornerstones to measure the width of your border. Mine is 5 inches wide. Just check all around the quilt if that measure suits you, according to your appliques. If needed, make the border larger or maybe more narrow. Measure 5 inches opposite the cornerstones and join the marks all around the quilt. You must obtain a large square. Also check the right angles by measuring the diagonals of the quilt top. The two measures must have the same length. If so, your quilt's a real square at right angles. Then, trim off the excess fabric, batting and backing using your rotary cutter and a long ruler. Now, you can attack the binding. Cut straight grain strips 5.5 inches wide and assemble them in a strip that is at least 6 yards long. Cut one small end in the bias. Fold the binding strip in two. Place it on your leg. It's easier to mark the fold. Work on the back side of the quilt. Match the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the quilt. Leave about a 4-inch tail and start sewing using a 1/4 inch seam allowance using the walking foot of your machine. Stop sewing at 1/4 inch from the corner and remove the quilt from the machine. Fold the binding so that it aligns with the edge that you will be sewing next. Place a pin. Then fold it down and align it on the edge you'll be sewing. Place another pin. Here I drew the diagonal to visualize the 45-degree fold. Sew along the second edge, starting and stopping at 1/4 inch from the corner. Don't stitch into the fold when you start. I remind you that you stitch the binding on the back of your quilt and draw your attention to the following point. I show you the work on a sample that is not heavily quilted. COLMAR has much more quilting stitches on it and therefore the edges might be really wavy. If you just place the binding on the edge and sew, your binding won't lie flat. Therefore, when you place the binding, you must sustain the quilt very lightly by very gently pulling the binding. To finish the binding, leave about 8–10 inches free. Open the tails, overlap the beginning and ending, and pin them onto the quilt. Then, with a pencil, draw the 45-degree line onto the bottom tail . remove the pins and trace a second line 1/2 inch off this line. This will give you a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. Cut on that line, pin both ends together, and sew from one intersection point to another. Fold the binding in two, pin and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You're now ready to work on the right side of your quilt. Take the pins off if you haven't done so yet. Press or finger press the seam. On the back, the meters form quite naturally. You can pin it in place and on the front, place one pin there we go. Form the meter by folding the fabric at a 45-degree angle. Place another pin on top and remove the first one. Place pin all around the quilt to fix the binding. And normally machine stitching should be covered by the binding. Then take a needle threaded with pearly 8 and sew running stitches all along. This technique has the advantage to embellish and being faster at one time. Fix the meters, and by doing these stitches you don't need to stitch through all layers. This year is now over. Time went by so fast for us. We hope it was the same for you. Claudine and I hope you had fun quilting and stitching COLMAR. Hope that you enjoyed doing trapunto and embroidering your quilt with us. Maybe you'll want to join us for another embroidered block of the month in the future. Meanwhile, thank you Quiltmania and thank you Carol. Bye bye.